It started with a yard sale. That's the first domino that toppled, that you'd never guess it at the time. We were in the middle of May, Missouri heat already humming like a broken air conditioner, and Joan had this sudden compulsion to declutter. Declutter, in this case, meaning she pointed at things I hadn't touched in years but somehow still cared deeply about. My high school Letterman jacket, which technically doesn't fit but holds sentimental sweat, a stack of old Popular Mechanics magazines, and the model airplane I never finished building because, well, it required patience and Joan doesn't believe in hobbies that involve tiny glue tubes. She was unusually enthusiastic about it. Not in a let's make room for the future way, but more like she was on a timed game show where the goal was to erase all signs of Peter McKinley from his own garage. Do you really need this? Or are you just holding on to it in case time machines get invented? She'd ask with that smile. The one that looks sweet from a distance but gets under your skin like a mosquito that's read a few self-help books. So there we were that Saturday, Joan setting up folding tables like a general planning a siege, and me dragging out boxes of what she called Peter's Museum of Irrelevant Crap. Karen from across the street wandered over before the first tablecloth was even smooth, clutching her usual iced tea in a cup the size of a toddler. Hey, Joni, looks like someone's trying to start a new chapter. Karen chirped. Joan winked. I can't overstate this. It wasn't a twitch. It was a deliberate, stage-lit, high school play-level wink. And not at Karen. At me. Like we were sharing some inside joke I hadn't been told about yet. Now, I've been married long enough to know that a wink is never just a wink. Especially not from a woman who alphabetizes her spice rack and once retiled the bathroom because she didn't like the vibe. The sale went off fine. We made $83, lost 2 extension cords to a guy named Chuck who didn't even haggle, and got sunburned in places I didn't know could get sunburned. But Joan? She was radiant. Like she'd just completed a spiritual cleanse via vintage teapots and rusty socket wrenches. Later that week, things started getting curious. Joan began taking night classes, or that's what she called them. Pottery appreciation, she said, which raised no red flags for me because Joan once took an online course titled The Geometry of Feelings, so her academic pursuits have always leaned toward the abstract. But here's the thing, she never brought home any pottery. Not a single lopsided mug. Not a tragic clay dog. Nothing. So I asked, as diplomatically as I could, don't they let you keep the pots? Oh, Pete, she said, her voice syrupy, you don't keep the appreciation. You experience it. I didn't respond. Mostly because I was trying to figure out if that answer had somehow wrapped around and become profound. A few days later, she left a note on the fridge, one of those little yellow sticky pads we bought in bulk when she decided we needed a communication station. It read, went to the library. Be back by 9. Don't forget to water the peace lily. We don't own a peace lily. Now, I'm not the suspicious type. I still believe vending machines give out free snacks if you hit the right code. But something about that note rubbed me wrong. Maybe it was the passive-aggressive reminder to water a plant that doesn't exist. Maybe it was the handwriting, slightly different from her usual neat rows of perfection. Or maybe it was the sudden realization that Joan had not, in the past decade, shown even mild interest in our public library, which she once referred to as a shrine to outdated microfiche. So I did what any man trying not to spiral would do. I went to the library, and there she was. Not Joan, but a man, sitting alone, wearing a very familiar wristwatch. Now, I don't claim to be some hyper-observant Sherlock Holmes type, but I'd recognize that watch anywhere. It had a tiny scratch right across the face, a souvenir from the time Joan dropped it behind the dryer and we had to call in her brother to dismantle the entire vent system. She swore up and down she returned it to the lost and found after the gym incident. Guess she forgot the part where she gave it to someone else. The man was reading The Art of Stillness. Ironic. I didn't approach. What was I going to say? Excuse me, sir, but are you part of my wife's sudden fascination with ceramics and botany? No. I'm a Midwestern man with dignity and a full tank of gas. So I left. Quietly. Casually. Like someone who just realized his wife might be taking more than emotional solace in adult education. Over the next few weeks, I noticed other things. Little things. Like how Joan's car smelled like sawdust one evening, even though we haven't had a workshop since the garage sale massacre. Or how she started humming again, but only when she thought I couldn't hear. Once, I passed the bathroom while she was flossing and heard her giggle. Giggle. Joan hasn't giggled since Bush was in office. The final straw wasn't dramatic. It was a Monday. I had taken the day off because the washing machine was doing that thing again where it screams like a banshee in protest. Joan came home early. She was wearing her library outfit. That's what I'd started calling it. Tasteful, wrinkle-free, with just enough makeup to make you wonder if there was a hidden camera crew somewhere. I asked her, point blank, over the hum of the dryer, "Joan, who's the guy with the watch?" She didn't flinch, didn't look surprised. She smiled, took a breath, and said, "Oh, Peter, you always did notice the strangest things." Then she walked off, humming again, like this was all part of some puzzle I'd been too slow to solve. So I did the only logical thing. I pulled out the old lawn chair, poured myself a glass of warm soda from the garage fridge, and sat under the porch light, waiting for the universe to send me a sign, or a meteor. But instead, it sent Karen. Again. "I saw Joan at Lowe's," she said. "Buying pottery?" I asked. "No. Buying lumber. With a man." I nodded. Then I laughed. Because if you can't laugh at the woman you love possibly starting a new life with a man who wears your old watch and builds birdhouses in his spare time, what can you laugh at? Joan started using a clipboard. That's when I knew things had shifted from weird to institutionally odd. Not a phone checklist, not a little notepad she could tuck into her purse like a normal suburban adult. No, an actual clipboard. Brown, standard issue, the kind you'd expect someone to use while assessing earthquake damage or inspecting the integrity of school cafeterias. She kept it in her tote bag and pulled it out at odd times, mostly on the couch, sometimes in bed, once at the DMV. "You making a grocery list for the military?" I asked the first time I noticed. "Just organizing a few things," she replied. That was it. Just a few things. You'd be surprised how often a person can say a few things while acting like they're managing a multi-billion-dollar logistics operation. Now, I wasn't planning on investigating anything. I wasn't trying to become some trench coat-wearing TV detective in orthopedic sneakers. I simply did what any bored husband with an above-average sense of suspicion and below-average boundaries might do. I checked the clipboard. I waited until she was in the shower, and I checked the clipboard. There were 3 columns, all in neat, Joan-style handwriting. Column 1, needs. Column 2, logistics. Column 3, boundaries. Not groceries. Not errands. Needs, logistics, boundaries. Needs included things like new stimulus, recalibration, and my personal favorite, reconnection, but without codependence. Logistics was where things got interesting. There were notes under that heading involving drive times, parking zones, and, most confusing of all, a list of library branch hours with little stars next to 2 locations and a double underline under Wednesday evenings. Boundaries just said, must not interfere with process, no surprises, and, at the very bottom in red pen, Peter equals stable variable. Do not disrupt. Now, I've been called a lot of things in my life, dependable, sarcastic, occasionally needlessly specific, but never a stable variable. It felt like I'd been categorized by someone preparing a science fair project about emotional detachment. So I did what I considered the healthy thing. I made a spreadsheet of my own. Just columns labeled Joanisms, suspicious behavior, and passive-aggressive comments. It helped. Gave me structure. For the record, Joanisms included. It's not secrecy, it's sacred space. You're confusing silence with avoidance again. We're just misaligned at the moment, not malfunctioning. I eventually began to suspect there was a second clipboard. That theory got legs one afternoon when I noticed Joan pull hers out during a phone call in the garage. I was in the driveway, checking the caulking on the windows because apparently that's what you do when your marriage feels like a PowerPoint presentation. She didn't see me. She was pacing around in socks, holding the clipboard, nodding, saying things like, "Yes, it aligns with what we mapped, and it's progressing, but still within the integration phase." Now, unless she'd become part of a secret government experiment or started managing underground city planning, I had to assume this had something to do with what I'd started calling, in my head, the other life. This wasn't a love affair. Not the traditional kind. It wasn't red wine and motel keys and blushing at the gym. No, this had become something far more bureaucratic. There were planning stages, feedback loops, and what I assumed were quarterly evaluations. I wasn't living with a cheating wife. I was living with a woman running a think tank. Naturally, I tried to play it cool. I told myself I'd wait it out, observe, collect data. But then Joan started referring to Thursdays as her alignment nights. Alignment of what? I asked once, pretending to be invested. Self? Values? Needs? Do you align better when I'm not home? She didn't laugh. She wrote something on the clipboard. Then came the flyer. It arrived one Thursday in a stack of mail, mixed in between an ad for discount tires and a credit card offer I couldn't tell if I had already rejected twice. A half-folded printed flyer on thick, glossy paper, like something your yoga teacher would hand out during a nervous breakdown. It was titled Deep Connect, Facilitated Expansion for Modern Relationships. I stared at the tagline below, because healthy disconnection is the first step to conscious reconnection. There were words on there that didn't exist in the English language before 2017. I flipped it over. Joan's name was listed in the Community Contributors section, right under a woman named Serenity, no last name, and just above someone referred to as Eli, certified soul cartographer. I didn't confront her. I just left it on her clipboard one evening and waited. She found it around 10:15 p.m. I was in bed pretending to read a book I'd already finished. She stood there holding the flyer, her eyes scanning it like it was a crossword puzzle she forgot filling out. "Oh," she said. "You saw that?" "I did," I said. "Soul cartography sounds exhausting. I didn't put that on the fridge because I wasn't sure you were ready. I've been a stable variable for years, Joan. What could possibly scare me now?" She didn't laugh. She made another note. By this point, we were living in two realities, running on parallel tracks. One where we discussed our grocery lists and adjusted thermostat settings like a normal couple, and another where Joan's schedule began to resemble that of a covert agent attempting to merge with a parallel version of herself in secret. Eventually, the secret showed up in khakis. At first, I thought he was someone canvassing for local elections. He had that posture. Knocked on our door one afternoon holding a binder and a smile so polished it could have been laminated. "Hi, I'm Mitchell," he said. "I'm looking for Joan?" "She's out not aligning at the moment," I said. He blinked. "Ah, well, I can wait in the car if that's better." I didn't respond. Just stood there, watching him tap his fingers against the binder like it was a passport into some plane of existence where I was a background character in my own home. "Who are you again?" I finally asked. "I'm her partner." I raised an eyebrow. "In what? Is this tax-related?" He smiled like I was the joke. "No, we're navigating together." "Are you from Deep Connect?" "No, but I know Serenity," he said, proudly. "I've been facilitating my own spiral growth for almost 6 months now." Spiral growth sounds circular. Progress isn't linear. That explains your khakis. Joan arrived 5 minutes later, breathless, holding her second clipboard. There was definitely a second clipboard. "Peter," she said carefully, "this is Mitchell." I wasn't ready to introduce him yet, but I met him. He's very spiral. "I can explain," she started. "You won't need to. I'm just a stable variable. I'll be upstairs making a list of things I apparently never needed to understand." And I did. Right next to the spreadsheet, I opened a Word doc titled Joan's Binder Parade and started cataloging every moment that turned my marriage into a low-budget documentary about self-reinvention. That was the day I stopped being confused and started being curious. There's nothing quite as sobering as watching your wife and her clipboard buddy sort through emotional vocabulary in your living room while you pretend to care about an appliance catalog just to avoid blinking too loudly. Mitchell had returned the next evening, this time without his binder but with a recycled tote bag, which he carefully placed next to the armchair like it contained precious scrolls from the ancient order of self-important midlife realizations. Joan was beside him, beaming in that calm, serene way people do when they're confident they're about to explain something insane and want credit for being emotionally prepared. I didn't say anything. I sat on the edge of the couch cushion, holding a brochure about dishwashers and nodding occasionally like I was deeply invested in the future of stainless steel spray arms. I figured if Joan could have alignment nights, I was allowed appliance nights. "Peter," she started, with that voice she usually used for explaining tax forms or when she wanted me to agree to something before I fully understood what it was. "We're in a place of transition. You've probably noticed." I looked up. "You're in a place of transition." "I'm still in the place with the mortgage." Mitchell let out a small, knowing chuckle. I think it was supposed to signal patience, but it mostly just made me want to hand him a remote and see if he could figure out our TV input settings. Joan continued. "Mitchell and I are working through some important personal material together. It's part of a larger movement." "Is this like CrossFit but for emotions?" "No," she said, visibly swallowing whatever comeback she had planned. "It's a relationship renovation." "Well, just make sure you apply for the right permits before tearing down any structural walls." Mitchell cleared his throat like he wanted the floor. "Peter, I want to acknowledge your discomfort. This process, while perhaps unconventional, is rooted in honesty and the dismantling of false security. Appreciate the acknowledgement, Mitchell. I feel seen. Now, what exactly are you doing here? Is this a pitch? Do you need me to sign something? Joan reached into her tote. Her clipboard was already resting on her knees and pulled out what looked like a laminated map. I couldn't make out all the details from where I was sitting, but I caught the title in bold, Pathways of Multiplicity, Charting Sustainable Intimacy Structures. Is this a board game? I asked. Do I roll dice, or is it more of a choose-your-own-disaster type thing? Mitchell leaned forward with that same patient face people use when they explain essential oils to skeptics. It's a visual tool, he said, to map out the overlapping needs and directions of evolved relational dynamics. That sounds like the back of a shampoo bottle. Joan, surprisingly, laughed at that. Mitchell didn't. She composed herself quickly and tapped one of the circles on the laminated chaos. This represents a junction point. That's where we are. Where conversations open. Where we acknowledge our truths. And here I thought we were just in the living room. At this point, the urge to throw the whole chart in the recycling bin and call a lawyer was quietly sitting in the back of my mind, filing its nails. But I wasn't there yet. I wasn't angry. Not exactly. I was employed. I had a job to do. And that job was now observing my wife as she slowly removed herself from our marriage using coordinated office supplies. Peter, Joan said, this isn't about breaking anything. It's about broadening. Broadening what? Us. Are we now a cul-de-sac? She sighed. Look, I get that this seems strange to you. But Mitchell and I are engaged in a connection that's allowed me to access parts of myself I thought were long buried. You know, you sound like a deleted scene from a self-help documentary, right? Mitchell raised his hand slightly, like he was mediating a spiritual parent-teacher conference. Peter, may I ask, do you feel threatened by this evolution? No, I said. I feel exhausted. You people are exhausting. This whole house has turned into a TED Talk nobody asked for. Joan stood up, gathering her materials. We didn't come here to fight. We came here to bring clarity. Mission accomplished. Nothing's clearer than my wife and a guy with a tote full of diagrams telling me I'm outdated. Do I get a certificate? Or does that come after the next alignment? They left without slamming the door, which somehow made it worse. I sat there in the silence, the laminated charts still sitting on the coffee table like an infomercial exploded. I picked it up, looked at all the intersecting circles and jargon. One section read Sacred Ambiguity Zone. I briefly considered framing it and hanging it above the sink. The following week was quiet. Joan was home, but only technically. She floated around like she was subletting the air. We talked less. She updated her calendar more. The clipboards multiplied. I counted 3 in one day. One on the coffee table, one on the nightstand, one sticking out of the hamper like a misplaced tax form. Then came the workshop. She left a printed flyer on the kitchen counter with her morning tea mug, her half-full morning tea mug, which I noted, because apparently hot beverages are only sacred if they're unfinished. The flyer was advertising a shared truth retreat in the next county over. The title was Rewilding the Narrative, Undoing Monogamy with Love and Charts. It cost $240 and included breakout sessions. I was not invited. I waited until she left, then pulled out my notebook. I wasn't journaling. I was tracking data. I listed the key phrases from the flyer. Trust-based detangling. Radical non-ownership. Collaborative closure models. I had no idea what any of it meant, but I figured if you could build IKEA furniture without instructions, you could probably reverse engineer a dissolving relationship using buzzwords and passive-aggressive cohabitation. I wrote one final note. Joan is in a shared truth retreat with a man who owns a reusable tote and a vocabulary I don't trust. I didn't ask questions when she came back 3 days later wearing a sweatshirt that said Conscious Expansion Club. I didn't comment on the fact that she now referred to Mitchell as her growth mirror. I simply resumed my own schedule. Started going to the library. Started looking into estate planning. And I definitely started labeling every item in the house with color-coded sticky notes. Hers. Mine. Ambiguous. Because if you're going to be categorized, you might as well categorize right back. The week Joan added a corkboard to the wall of our living room, I knew she'd crossed into a new phase of development, what I like to call advanced domestic overreach. She didn't even ask. Just nailed it up there like it had always belonged, right between the thermostat and the print of that painting she bought at a farmer's market called Intentional Stillness. It's a painting of a folding chair on a white background. In case you're wondering how much intentionality was involved. Peter, she said that morning while pinning color-coded cards onto the board, we're moving into the integration window. I was trying to sync the universal remote at the time, which compared to her relationship matrix felt like a warm bath. I looked at her and the corkboard like I was seeing someone rearrange the chairs on a train that had left the tracks 2 towns ago. Are you starting a nonprofit or hosting auditions? She turned around, serious. No, it's part of the reorientation framework. You say that like it's something everyone should have on their wall next to the furnace schedule. She ignored me and pinned up a new index card that said Fluid Intentions, Check-in Friday. Let's pause here. Check-in Friday wasn't something we did as a couple. It wasn't us checking in on bills or what show to binge. This was her and Mitchell, and I know this because I accidentally glanced at her email on the shared iPad the day before and saw a recurring event called Open Vessel Sync, M+J Home Node. I'm not sure what kind of person creates a calendar event labeled Home Node, but I was pretty sure they shouldn't be invited into my garage again. By then, I'd stopped asking direct questions. Joan's answers had graduated from vague to performance art. Her logic came with footnotes and circular references. I'd get halfway through her explanation of emotional decentralization and start wondering if I'd actually fallen asleep and dreamed her voice in podcast format. So I did what any adult male of limited emotional vocabulary and growing sarcasm would do. I made a bingo card. Yes, a real one. I printed it out and taped it to the inside of my sock drawer. The squares included holding space, energetic mismatch, mapping transitions. Peter, you're too fixed in linearity. This isn't about betrayal, it's about emergence. I hit bingo on a Wednesday when she referred to our 14-year marriage as a legacy co-narrative with hierarchical tones. At this point, my friends had started noticing. Well, not all of them, just Greg, who drops by unannounced to borrow tools he never returns. He came over to grab my socket wrench set again and caught sight of the corkboard. What's that? Don't ask. Greg peered closer, read one of the cards that said consent to reimagine domestic roles, and blinked. Is this about taxes? In a way, I said. I think I've been emotionally audited. He whistled low. You need to come to poker night. Now, I hadn't gone to poker night in months. Mostly because it conflicted with Joan's Wednesday container evenings, which were previously called silent integration hours, which were once just Wednesdays. But I agreed. I went. And let me tell you, nothing clears your head like sitting in a room full of men trying to bluff over store-bought chips while pretending they understand their wives' new interest in transformative consciousness. It was during that night I decided I needed to participate. Not in their conversation. In Joan's new project. Not supportively, no. Not resentfully either. Strategically. If Joan was mapping her evolving truth with thumbtacks and soft lighting, then I'd draw my own chart. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to beg. I was going to document. So I started a second corkboard. Mine was in the garage. I didn't announce it. I just put it up. My first card was Chronology of Incomprehensible Conversations, and the second was Witnessed Emotional Guests Non-Peter. I used green pins for statements, yellow for observable behaviors, and blue for passive-aggressive utility changes. That last one was necessary because Joan had begun setting the thermostat to 63 degrees during high vibrational processing, which I assumed meant anything that made sense being frozen out of the house. She found the board a few days later when she went out to look for the garden shears, which I had conveniently stored near the evidence. Peter, what is this? My corkboard. Why? To organize my internal chaos through visual narrative anchoring. She stared. Are you mocking me? No, Joan. I'm mirroring your methodology. This is a collaborative space, remember? She didn't say anything. Just walked out, clipboard in hand. I added another card, Retreat via Ambiguity. That weekend, she went to a decentralized commitment circle at a friend's backyard. I stayed home and labeled our spice rack with new categories, Joan's, Peter's, and too complex to classify. Things progressed. Joan hosted a gathering. Yes, in the house. Yes, without discussing it with me beforehand. It was called Fluid Partnership Dialogue Pod, and it included folding chairs in a circle, tea in jars with chalkboard labels, and a guy named Milo who wore socks with messages on them. His left foot said, healing. The right said, now. They used phrases like self-referenced resonance, containment fatigue, and parallel synergy fields. I know this because I took notes. I didn't sit in. I walked around the house casually, doing nonchalant chores while listening through thin walls and wondering how anyone kept a straight face when saying, let's not gatekeep our expansions. Later, I was invited to share how I felt. I declined. Politely. then added invitation to share feelings at non-Peter event to the board. But here's the thing. I wasn't angry. Not in the fire-breathing, plate-throwing way you expect in these scenarios. I was fascinated. Watching Joan unspool her life into diagrams and workshops and tote bag partners had become an intellectual exercise. Like living with a reality show that didn't require cable. I couldn't look away. I couldn't even be properly jealous. Mitchell and his laminated charts were less of a threat and more of a walking case study. Still, I knew I had to respond somehow. Not with confrontation. With clarity. With something practical. So I called a realtor. Not to sell. Just to get information. Turns out, if you own a house together and one party starts inviting synergy field collaborators into shared spaces, you can't just draw a line down the middle with masking tape. You need paperwork. Discussions. Boundaries that can't be pinned on corkboards. So I scheduled a meeting. Not with a lawyer. Not yet. Just with myself. On my own calendar. It was titled Possible Exit Strategy, Legacy Co-Narrative Adjustment. Because if Joan could reframe our marriage into a series of flowcharts, then I could restructure my patience into a project plan. Joan decided we needed a household mission statement. She presented it on a Tuesday night after her co-creation cluster Zoom call, which had gone 43 minutes over and caused our shared internet to crash halfway through my attempt to watch a documentary about historical bridges. I never got to see how the bridge held up, but I'm fairly sure it was more structurally sound than my marriage. I was folding laundry. Joan walked in with her usual presentation tone, somewhere between someone trying to sell you timeshares and someone about to announce a mandatory fasting retreat. Peter, she said, unfolding a sheet of paper with actual bullet points, I believe we're at a juncture that calls for realignment through intentional language. I've drafted a mission statement. Of course she did. I didn't respond immediately. I took a deliberate moment to finish folding the towel in my hand. It had a small bleach spot in the corner, which felt symbolic, but I didn't mention that out loud. No need to give Joan poetic ammo. She was already armed with stationery. She cleared her throat. Would you like to hear it? Do I get to submit amendments, or is this a final draft situation? We can workshop it. I nodded. Proceed. She read it out loud as if auditioning for a TEDx talk. We, the cohabitants of 129, Brighton Avenue, commit to fostering a space of mutual curiosity, collaborative transformation, and fluid relational frameworks grounded in respect and emerging needs. I blinked. You know we live in a 3-bedroom with squeaky vents and a fuse box from 1994, right? Not a Scandinavian startup. This isn't about the building, she replied, unbothered. It's about the container. The container? The energetic container we co-create. Well, I'd like to opt out of the container and rejoin the floor plan, if that's allowed under the new constitution. She didn't smile. She rarely did any more unless Mitchell said something with a hyphen in it. Still, I gave her credit. A mission statement was oddly fitting. It formalized what we'd already been doing, living next to each other while operating on unrelated timelines. Joan tacked it onto the corkboard. The corkboard had grown since last time. It now had levels. There were small strings connecting different cards, like she was trying to solve a cold case where the victim was our emotional intimacy. On one end, a section titled Interpersonal Edge Work, and on the other, Transitional Anchors, pending. I wasn't sure what those meant, but I recognized my name on one of the middle cards. It simply said Peter, per familiarity/fixed polarity. Sounded like a setting on a malfunctioning thermostat. She started inviting people over again. Not Mitchell this time. New ones. People with vague professions, facilitators, recalibrators, resonance mediators. One of them was named Tamsin, and she introduced herself by saying she was currently between modalities. She asked if I'd be attending that evening's conflict decompression circle. I told her I'd rather unclog the shower drain, which, oddly enough, was also on my to-do list. At some point during the week, I began cataloging her guests in a small notebook. I called it the auxiliary cast list. Each person got a bullet point, a professional title, usually made up on the spot, and a quote. From that alone, you'd be amazed how much you learn about someone. Example. Wesley, radical flow architect. I don't believe in apologies. I believe in acknowledgments without urgency. Tamsin, transpersonal facilitator in transition. Have you ever cried horizontally while listening to a bowl? Dorian, boundaries engineer. What we think of as cheating is just outdated sovereignty vocabulary. I didn't make any of those up. I'd listened from the kitchen while relabeling the spice rack again, this time with categories like marital distractions, open-ended feelings, and preserved irony. No one noticed. No one cared. Joan was too busy managing her overlapping emotional Excel sheets. The people around her spoke with such confidence, you'd think they were building a rocket ship powered by vibes. The thing was, despite all the word clouds and organic teas, no one asked me how I was doing. They referred to me sometimes. Indirectly. Joan's anchor. Her contrast. That grounding presence in the domestic field. Once I walked into the room during a group session and someone said, the known element. Imagine being the human equivalent of a refrigerator magnet. Steady, practical, ignored until you're in the way of a new aesthetic. That night, I started a new list in my notebook called Exit Cues. Joan had ordered a floor cushion labeled Meditation Throne. The thermostat was permanently locked at Fresh Clarity Zone 67 degrees. A calendar event called Sensual Non-Disruption Day was booked. I wasn't listed. Our shared Amazon account history included 5 books with the word unbecoming in the title. I added all of them. Just observations. Nothing rash. No wild conclusions. Just stacking blocks. One afternoon, I came home, and there was a laminated sign on the door that said, "Please enter with intentionality. This is a container of conscious recalibration." Underneath, in smaller font, "Shoes and assumptions off." I stood there for a full minute. Thought about taking off one shoe, then hopping in to complete the bit. But I didn't. I walked in with both shoes on, marched straight to my garage board, and added a new card. Threshold Theater, boundaries imposed via font choice. It was clear now. Joan wasn't cheating in the old-fashioned sense. That would have been almost refreshing, honestly. She wasn't sneaking off or making up stories. She was replacing me with an ideology that didn't require deception. Just gradual substitution. Mitchell hadn't shown up in a while. I had a theory he'd been deprioritized in her new structure. In his place, there was now a virtual group called the Resonance Hive, which met on Thursdays to talk about interpersonal sovereignty and emotional exit ramps. I know because I listened to it once while washing the car. Her volume was up. They spoke with the cadence of people who think they're inventing morality. Every sentence started with, "for me," and ended in open-ended questions that sounded deep but went nowhere. After that session, Joan came into the garage. "Peter, I've been thinking. We may want to open a conversation about mutual release. Like balloons." She paused. "No. As a practice." I nodded. "Am I supposed to laminate my response, or is verbal still acceptable?" She didn't answer. She just walked back inside. Later that night, I did a little math. Joan's mission statement had been updated 3 times in a month. The corkboard had 17 new strings. The dishwasher still leaked. And I hadn't been hugged in 58 days. That number felt right. Measurable. Concrete. I circled it in my notebook. By now, the corkboard had evolved into a visual representation of Joan's life, not mine. It looked like a 10th grade science project on the mating rituals of confused mammals, if those mammals could also describe their feelings in 12-step phrases. Each new card I added made it clearer. This was her space, her system, her network of co-creators and boundary engineers. I was just there. A constant variable she didn't quite know what to do with. When Joan told me she was attending a conflict navigation workshop, I nearly asked if I could come along. I didn't. Instead, I Googled the facilitator, a guy named Devin who described his job as harmonization architect and subconscious reconstruction specialist. I'd be lying if I didn't picture him with a clipboard that had manifesting possibilities written on it. I didn't ask Joan about the workshop. That's the thing. Asking about these things always led to explanations I wasn't equipped to handle. When she started talking about emotional resonance fields and empathic non-attachment, I just nodded along, pretending I was up to speed. I had an entire mental Excel sheet open, categorizing her new words, like she was collecting synonyms for words that no one else used. Maybe it was some sort of linguistic evolution. Maybe not. The weirdest part wasn't even that Joan was attending these workshops. The weirdest part was that I was beginning to understand why. Not on an emotional level, mind you, but on a pragmatic one. She had mastered the art of making me feel irrelevant while at the same time, inexplicably, a part of her journey. It was like being included in a conversation about cloud computing even though I couldn't operate the damn things. I didn't need to understand it. I just needed to be present. For weeks, she'd been on this transformational odyssey. She told me once, "I've learned to embrace what I've been avoiding for years, Peter. I'm finally opening up to the truths we've buried in our subconscious." I tried to imagine what she could have been avoiding, and I came up with a list. It went as follows. House cleaning schedules. The fact that I don't care about crystals. That time she accidentally backed into the fence. Basic social interactions. Our actual relationship. I didn't vocalize that list. Instead, I started pretending to be absorbed in my own projects. I rearranged the tools in the garage for fun. I organized the closet so well that I had to pull half of it out just to find the vacuum cleaner. Joan's transformation didn't seem to involve any actual change in her behavior. It just involved new, more pleasant terminology for things that had been bothering her for years. Like her relationship with me, for example. When she wanted space, it was conscious uncoupling. When she was annoyed, it was processing emotional blockage. When she was distracted by something, it was shifting priorities in the moment. I didn't know what was worse, her trying to make our issues sound elegant, or my inability to refute them with anything that didn't sound like I was trying to go back to a time when we just sat and watched TV without talking about how the screen could symbolize something deeper. The real kicker came when she started talking about the need for circular connection. She brought it up after she returned from yet another growth retreat, this time one that spanned an entire weekend. She said she'd learned that relationships could be more than linear, they could be cyclical, revolving around shared energy, without the pressure to perform in traditional roles. I stared at her for a while. So, we just go around in circles now? No, she said patiently, like I was missing some deep cosmic point. Not circles. Circularity. Right, of course. I'll get the diagram. She smiled softly. You don't need to understand all of it, Peter. I know this seems like a lot, but it's important to me. I'm stepping into my power. And I want you to do the same. Stepping into your power was a phrase I'd heard before. It was something Joan liked to say when she'd gone through a particularly intense self-help video series or when Mitchell had updated his multidimensional reality framework, as if that was a thing. I'd always hoped it would involve more walking and less talking, but at least I was getting good at smiling and nodding. There was a gap in my head where I used to store emotions. Joan's self-discovery sessions, her intentional practices, and her need to separate everything into emotional categories and color-coded grids had somehow removed all the feelings I had once assumed were natural to a marriage. I wasn't sad or angry anymore. I was just tired. Tired of being part of someone's social experiment. Tired of trying to be part of the relationship without knowing if I even belonged in it anymore. One night, Joan came home from one of her workshops and sat me down on the couch. This was no ordinary couch sitting. She arranged the pillows first, adjusted her hair, and then told me she wanted to revisit the dynamic. I didn't ask what dynamic. I just waited. I've been thinking, she said, her voice dropping in tone, like she was preparing to reveal the secret code to the universe. You know, about us. I couldn't help myself. Did it involve someone else named Mitchell? She didn't flinch. No. Well, yes, but in a different sense. What sense? Not that sense, Peter. It's about collaboration. Collaboration, I repeated, not entirely sure if I'd lost track of the conversation or if it was just evolving in real time like a computer virus. Is this the part where you get a patent on your feelings? I'm serious, she insisted. I want us to reconnect, but in a way that transcends the traditional partnership model. I don't need you to just be here, physically. I need you to be present on a higher frequency. Frequency? What frequency are we on? AM or FM? Peter, I'm asking you to step into this with me. We have to find a way to vibrate at the same level. And right now, I'm not sure you're ready. I leaned back and stared at her. She was staring at me, waiting for something. What? I wasn't sure. Validation? Approval? A breakdown? What do you want from me, Joan? Because I'm not sure what you're asking me to do anymore. You've got your workshops, your corkboards, your endless circles of energy, and I'm still here, doing the same things I've been doing for the past 15 years. How do I fit into your vision of me now? Her eyes softened. You don't need to fit, Peter. You just need to be. Well, that's the problem, I said. I've been being for years, and it doesn't seem to be working out. She didn't answer. She just looked at me with this almost pitying expression. I'm not saying you have to change, Peter. I'm saying I've changed, and I need to move forward in a different direction. I could feel the room getting smaller, like it was closing in on me. Her words didn't sound like a request. They sounded like a decree. Right? I said. So, we're done here? No, she said softly. I don't want to end things. I just want us to redefine things. Define them however you want, Joan. I'm just here for the ride now. And with that, I knew it wasn't just a marriage that was ending. It was the version of me that had fit into it. To her, I was a fixture, a background element in her grand narrative of self-discovery. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I was willing to play the part anymore. Joan left her mission statement on the fridge even after she moved out. I noticed it while reaching for the orange juice I wasn't planning to drink. It was still laminated, still centered, still very Joan, organized, precise, and somehow emotionally vague. I stood there, reading it again like it was going to reveal something new. It didn't. I peeled it off and set it on the counter next to the unpaid water bill. She hadn't moved everything out, not yet. The meditation throne was gone. So were her 6 corkboards, the essential oil diffuser she never used, and the bookshelf full of literature about transcending ego states. But she left the framed quote near the front door that said, "Live in the question." I'd always assumed that was just decor, not an actual lifestyle directive. It had been 2 weeks since her final revision of our shared understanding, which basically meant she wanted to pursue plural connections, stay emotionally available in parallel, and dissolve the traditional cohabitation framework. In normal people English, she wanted to leave, but she didn't want it to feel like leaving. I suppose that was supposed to make me feel better. She didn't pack dramatically. There was no suitcase in the hallway, no thrown-together bags. It was more like a polite ghost was disappearing one item at a time. The vases left, then the yoga mat, then the tea. At some point, I realized the only things left were either mine or things too symbolic to transport. She left a note, handwritten, which was surprising. Joan usually favored digital platforms for her final words, shared Google Docs, or scheduled emails with color-coded categories. The note read, "Peter, thank you for giving me the space to become. You were the ground I stood on while I found my wings. Please know I value our journey deeply, even if my path now looks different. I wish you nothing but peace, clarity, and continued presence. With care. Joan." I stared at it for a long time. Not because it moved me. Not because it hurt. Because it sounded like she had copied it from a customer service script. "We regret your inconvenience. Please accept this coupon for 10% off your next relationship." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. There was nothing to respond to. Her note wasn't a question. It was a conclusion. But I did keep the note. Tucked it in a folder where I had all the things I didn't know what to do with. Our first utility bill, a printed photo of us from a neighbor's barbecue, and the wedding program with a typo in her name that she never noticed. I didn't call anyone. I didn't make a big announcement. I didn't tell the guys at work. When Greg asked if Joan was still doing those crystal seminars, I said no. She had moved on to advanced detachment with supportive language. He blinked, nodded, and asked if I wanted to go bowling Friday. I said sure. The funny thing is, I wasn't sad. Not exactly. Not in the way people imagine heartbreak. I wasn't sitting around wondering how it all went wrong. I knew how it went wrong. It didn't explode. It expanded. Slowly, and with forms to fill out. One afternoon, I walked into the garage, looked at my corkboard. Yes, it was still up, and took a breath. I pulled off every card. Every sarcastic summary, every quote, every category. Tossed them all in a cardboard box. Not out of anger. Just out of necessity. I didn't need the data anymore. I already knew the conclusion. I wasn't part of her story. I was her environment. That weekend, I took down the framed quote by the door. I didn't smash it. I just put it in the hall closet next to the old printer and the never-used waffle iron. And then, without telling anyone, I sat down and wrote something for myself. Not a mission statement. Not a breakup letter. Just a sentence. I existed fully, even when I wasn't being seen. It didn't need to be laminated. It didn't go on the fridge. Just a sentence. Mine. The end. Thanks for watching. Rate the story in the comments. Subscribe to the channel